everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of The Familiar Realm, the video interview series where we discuss the creative work and practices of up-and-coming artists we know. I am Katie Neece.
And I'm Anna Fleming.
And we're excited to be here today with artist James Ostrander, who is currently an MFA candidate in painting at the University of Notre Dame. So welcome, James.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so if we could, we'll proceed into the interview with asking questions, and we will be, asking you about your work and practice. And so I'm really excited to dive a little into that with you and Anna as well. So talk to us about your work and yourself, and we'll get this, kind of going.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's pretty general. So I'll just sort of get into it. I've been painting for quite a long time now. Man, I can't even, I guess, 15 years or so. And I'm kind of started out as a romantic artist. It's a big part of my work, is this kind of pursuit of the sublime and transcendence in art. And over time have kind of transitioned into a more self-reflexive investigation of Romanticism and sort of other forms of cultural inheritance. So that's been largely what I've been engaging with in grad school so far. And it seems to be what I'll be engaging with for the time, probably the next couple years at least. We'll see where we go from there. It's, I guess, the most broad definition that I could give.
Where did you go to school for your undergrad?
So it's this little, it's kind of embarrassing. I'm always embarrassed to say, because it's Cornell College, and most people will immediately, oh, Ithaca, yeah. Which is obviously not Cornell College. That's Cornell University, a far more prestigious institution than Cornell College. But it's a little liberal arts college in Mount Vernon, Iowa, which is actually a very nice place and really unique place. One course at a time. So you take 8 or 9 classes a year, but you finish them in a month. So it's like you meet every day for 4 or 5 hours and go to class, and it's kind of almost like high school in some ways, but it was great. It was really nice. So I did geology and studio art there, double majored, which is kind of a strange combination, but
Yeah, that's really interesting with like how what we'll see in your work coming up, how maybe, that geological kind of background matter has influenced your practice, which I'm excited to talk more about, I think, with you on that too. But how long did you spend in Iowa in general during that time?
I mean, I guess I was there for the full 4 years, and then after that, I was here and there, Minnesota, California. I spent some time in Guatemala in 2013, but for the most part, I was just there for the duration of undergrad, 4 years. It's a very unique place, Iowa, but very similar in a lot of ways to Minnesota, or I suppose Illinois or Indiana, very Midwestern.
Yeah, kind of the plains /
The plains,
Midwest.
farms and suburbs. And
Did you always know you wanted to pursue an MFA and go to grad school? Did you do that right after undergrad, or was there a little time between? Can you tell us a little bit about that decision that you made?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually didn't take any drawing or painting classes in high school at all, and didn't even really get into any until late freshman year or early sophomore year. I don't really recall. Definitely didn't know. I was really into art history in high school. I never took any art history classes in high school, but I was very interested in the Surrealists and in a couple of different sort of bodies of work that I would see at, just the Minneapolis Institute of Arts or whatever. So I knew I liked art, but I had no idea what I wanted to do. And that's probably part of the reason why I took the double major. Is at some point along the way, I don't remember exactly when, I don't have like a fantastic story about when I knew exactly when I was gonna be an artist, but I had this, I guess I just had an intro class to painting, and it was actually sort of miserable. The professor was brutal. He's now like one of my favorite people, but he was pretty brutal, and it's a nightmare to get into art classes. This is just a sort of aside, but it's so hard. We had a bidding system there, so you almost had to bet points, and you had a limited amount of points. So classes that people didn't want to take, this is very weird now saying this, but you would bid low amounts on classes that nobody cared about, and you would bid really high amounts on things like drawing one or painting one, because everybody who's going for that degree needs those, but also, it's a liberal arts school, so there's arts credits required. And so I misbid, and I didn't get into a number of intro classes. So I actually never had an intro drawing class or an intro painting class, and I went right into one of the advanced ones and didn't know what I was doing. So I don't know. Somewhere along the line, I decided that I wanted to paint, but then all the professors would say, "You're going to be a great art professor someday," which I took as a terrible insult because I wanted to be a painter, not an art professor. So eventually I grew into that, and now I think it's hilarious that I didn't see that in myself, but clearly the professors did. So I did geology as it's funny to say, but I did it as this kind of backup. I guess I needed to have some sort of like credible degree to leave undergrad with. And I loved it. I thought it was great, but that's a whole other topic. But geology has a very limited pool of jobs that you can go into. It tends towards resource management, which I wasn't really that interested in. So I don't know. Sorry, that was a very circuitous.
No, how did you end up at Notre Dame after Cornell?
Oh, right. Yeah. So I graduated in 2012, 2013. I had to finish up some classes, I went and did Spanish classes in Guatemala. And so I technically graduated in 2013. And then I applied to a bunch of grad schools. Well, I say a bunch, but I applied to maybe 4 or 5 in 2013. Didn't get in anywhere and became very despondent. And I didn't paint for a couple of years there, from 2013 to 2015 probably. And then I don't know, I just kind of fell back into it eventually. During that time, I was just working in a factory, a print factory, which was very painful to be. Sometimes we would get jobs to print out the paintings that kind of look like paintings, but they're not, they're prints. And they even go as far as, injection heat pressing them. So they have raised brush strokes and stuff, and they'll go sell them for $400 or $500 a pop at Home Depot or whatever, some big box store. That was kind of soul crushing in some ways. And a friend of mine who had been in the art history program when there was still an art history grad program at Notre Dame had recommended the painting department to me on the grounds that a lot of the professors and a lot of the students were doing like figurative work, which I think was a big part of, I had when I didn't get into that first round of grad schools, I had just no idea what had happened, because I had good grades in undergrad and I thought I had a pretty strong portfolio, but I don't think I did in retrospect. And also I applied to a bunch of these schools like University of Chicago, where all the faculty who do painting are doing if they're even using paint still, they're doing really very non-objective style paintings. So I didn't understand that you have to find a school with like a good fit. Yes. So it took me a few years, and I reapplied in 2018, I guess. I took a community college course because I didn't have a space to work. And I pretty much built my entire portfolio in that community college course. It was sort of a godsend. So reapplied in 2018 to this program because I looked into it at my friend's request. I actually looked into Lucas Cordy's stuff, and that was like, oh yeah, cool. Like that was one that I really liked, and I think I saw some of Aaron Hines' stuff, and I don't know who else I would have seen work-wise, but yeah. So I applied and got in, and now I'm there.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting about the journey too of applying to grad schools, that I think not a lot of people, I'll talk about it for just briefly, but that not a lot of people talk about or discuss. And I think it's a really valuable thing to talk about and to be transparent about, is that schools are so different, and they do have to fit with what you want. And typically I hear people, the romantic idea about grad school is, oh yeah, like I'll just apply and like but then when you visit the school, and I applied to several schools and visited also, and some of them I was like, this is not a fit for me. Like
Yeah.
then I really started to see, like, do I want to study under certain people? You know, who do I really want to study under? Like, what would really be beneficial for me and my work, instead of just kind of throwing my applications out there randomly. And then, when I started thinking more that way, it was the same with you. Like, I more built up my work. I was more conscious about kind of the direction I was going in, and then more deliberate about the decisions I was making and the connections I was trying to make too. It's like it is beneficial to maybe either not only just visit, but also maybe sit in on a critique if you can somehow ask a professor, or somebody in the department to kind of give you an in on that kind of thing. And if those are open, then definitely, like, that's a really good move. Things like that. And some people aren't, able to do that, but most departments, or at least, in my experience, were really open to either visiting or questions, or, really the more curious you were, they're really, happy to give you information. So I think people are like reluctant, like it's a big monolith or something. And sometimes it can be.
This is scary.
It is really scary. And so, but people don't talk about the experience on the failures that happen, and how many times they've applied, and how disenchanted, you can get over rejections and over again.
Right.
And you just have to keep applying, even though it's like a rigorous and terrible process sometimes.
It was a very hard time, yeah, because I remember, coming out of undergrad, it was like a learning institute. It wasn't a research institution. Cornell, it's a learning school, and it's in the middle of Iowa. So I didn't really have, there's a lot of people who come out of, let's say, SAIC, who've been in this big urban center for a really long time and have had all these opportunities to show, and who get really accustomed to a certain type of like working artist mindset. Not so for me. And so when I got out of there, I only had, a couple exhibitions, like under, like, group shows or whatever. And then my final, the final show for the program. So I didn't know what to do in that regard. And then you just think, well, I need to find an art community. And if you're not super outgoing, then it's kind of like, you got to go to grad school, right? That's where the mind goes. And so then it's in the same sense. I feel like, when I applied to undergrad, I didn't have a plan for my future. So I didn't really know who I wanted to work with. I didn't even really know what I wanted to do. So you can't really I couldn't choose the school based on those things. And I feel like that was a good wake up call for me to be like, I can actually look for the kind of people I want to work with. And I can figure those things out really easily online and stuff, provided the department's doing their due diligence and keeping it up to date and everything like that, which I think Notre Dame is pretty good about. So but it was hard. Yeah, I remember being very miserable for a few years there.
Yeah, and then you think, you're I went through the motions of, hey, am I really supposed to do this?
Right.
Like, is
Oh,
this what
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
really supposed to be doing right now? Am I qualified for this? Am I like, and then the imposter syndrome sets in. But I always think about, well, if nobody told me about imposter syndrome, would I be suffering from it? So
Well,
kind of
somebody
like
had to
this
get that in your head.
psychological,
Yeah,
yeah. So I
yeah,
was just like, I'm gonna do my best, like, and I'm gonna try. I felt it in me that like I had to do that. Like it's something I'm super passionate about, and if you or any other artist, if this is the move that you need to do, then you have to be asking those questions of, what do I want, and how do I apply that to where I want to go. Whether it maybe not be grad school, maybe it's like a residency, or maybe
right.
it's like, taking some time off and figuring out what's working for you best, or you need to suss out some things, or, whatever it is. Um, that's important time that's spent in learning more about yourself, because I had no idea of what I was doing when I
Yeah.
got out of undergrad. I was just like, I wouldn't be prepared
No,
personally,
thank
but
God I didn't get in anywhere, because
yeah,
I would not have used my time well. So
personally, I was the same. And I know other people are different that way, and that might, be perfect timing for them. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of interesting, things that happen between undergrad and grad school.
absolutely.
Well, maybe using that as like a way to segue into some of your work, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how you see, in terms of the trajectory of your work and some of the like subject matter that you've been painting, the way maybe that you've been handling different painting techniques or working with different mediums. Can you tell us a little bit about how your work has changed since you've been in grad school, and even over the course of the past few years, since you're now entering into your final year, and going to work on your thesis show here soon, how your work has just changed, if there are any emphases in terms of like the ideas or the conceptual material you're working with, or even just the subject matter and the actual technique and materials.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, it's hard to know where to begin. I think like it's sort of inevitable that I'll end up talking about the Midwest and the suburbs with regard to the kind of motifs that I'm using now. And but also, conceptually speaking, I think, how do I put this? I'm in the suburbs right now. I'm in Minnesota, and I'm in the house I grew up in, and it's an interesting reminder of a certain kind of mentality that I had when I was a kid. So I've been thinking about it a lot. I think you get this idea of what like artists are supposed to do. You were talking about like people putting ideas into your head, Katie, and I think like somewhere along the line, I decided that the role of an artist was like to this sort of pursuit of this sort of transcendent forms. And I think that I don't think that's uniquely suburban. I think that that's pretty basic existential, but I think that there's a lot of Midwestern kids who are pretty stricken with a sort of like ennui, malaise, sort of malaise. I don't know why that is exactly, but growing up, I remember, angstily claiming that that there was no culture, like that suburbs are cultureless, which of course is not true in retrospect. But I don't know if I necessarily love the culture that exists here, but there's absolutely a culture, and I spent a lot of my early years as an artist trying to sort of maybe deny that I was a suburban person. Like I wanted to make art. And I think that's why I tended towards Romanticism, is that I wanted to make art that was that sort of transcended the banal or the worthless everyday crap of Andover, Minnesota, and I was going to make this, this beautiful, sublime, these masterpieces. So what you do is you go out with like an old digital camera, you take some photos of nature, and then you get rid of the power lines, and you get rid of the trash, and you get rid of the the little kids down there smoking cigarettes, and you get rid of all that other stuff, and then you're left with this beautiful transcendent landscape that of course never really reaches that. but I try, you know, so I'd make that kind of stuff. And when I got into undergrad, the work shifted a little bit, but I was still doing that. I mean, I still thought that the goal of the artist was to, what would I always say? To render the I don't remember. I thought I was going to just turn, you know, I was going to make it big and important and sublime, I guess is the best word I can use. So I think there was sort of this obsession with the transcendent. And then somewhere along the lines, when I got into undergrad, I got this kind of a sort of secondary interest that had to do with the body. And I don't know exactly where that came from, but I became very, almost kind of, there was a sense of maybe dysphoria attendant to it. I don't know exactly what. I used to call it, it was the entropic meat sack thing. That's what we would always call ourselves. And we were a lot of self-destructive behaviors in undergrad. And so that kind of found its way more firmly into the work. And I always joke that I was basically like a low quality Francis Bacon ripoff for most of undergrad, but I still had this interest in kind of this sense of elevation in some ways, which is funny now looking back on it, as I was simultaneously like obsessed about base materiality and just being like stuff and focusing so much on grotesque work. And so when I graduated, somewhere along the line, I started to realize that most of my favorite artists, whether that be musicians or visual artists, found ways to incorporate things that seemed to me to be fairly banal or prosaic, and they found ways to incorporate it in a way that was, well, what I interpreted as transcendent. And so I started trying to do that, and then I was just failing miserably at that because I didn't know how to do it. And then eventually I just kind of like, I think the stuff I applied to grad schools with in 2013 was all pretty much romantic. And I'm sure all of the stuff, I'm afraid to look back on the submission materials that I had because I'm sure I was writing some very strange things, pretty grandiose things, I'm assuming. And somewhere along the line, it just flipped and I became more interested, I guess, in the sense of like immanence over transcendence, just sort of what's there, and more interested in the story itself, right? Like the pursuit or the desire for meaning or the desire for beauty or God or whatever the sublime has come to stand for in the arts. And so conceptually anyway, that was, I think, the big shift that I had happen in the year, pretty much the year leading up to grad school, and then obviously since then. So the motifs go along with that as well. Like I would never have included like a dirty sock in a painting or a cigarette butt or anything along those lines. So that was fairly new. Materially too, I never worked with oil before grad school. Part of this was that, well, like I said earlier, Cornell College is on the block plan, and so we only had a month for the entirety of the painting class. And so it was basically acrylic all the time, because unless you were really, really good at managing your time, you just wouldn't be able to finish anything. Or I guess unless you were doing alla prima painting with oil, I guess you could get away with that, but I didn't know anything about that. So it was pretty much all acrylic. So I switched to that. And obviously we'll go into this later, but I've started to mess around with a lot of different materiality since being in grad school, which is a big part of why I applied, actually, is I wanted to have the sort of facilities to mess around with other stuff. So I'd say those are like the main shifts.
Yeah, would you mind maybe showing us some images of your work?
Sure, yeah. Let me, all right, that started up, so I'll just share my screen. This is in the sort of order that I showed it for final reviews this last semester. So this is work that I produced in the first year at Notre Dame. So still kind of engaging with like the romantic motif of nature. I like to call it like the Arcadian wilderness or the Edenic wilderness, but with this incorporation of the stuff of civilization, in this case, various garbage, detritus, and then so most of these, I like to say, really all of the work that I make is self-portraiture as well. So relating to me in some way. The one on the right, so the Do Brambles Prick the Animals was sort of the first piece that I produced there, and it got, I think it was like a good foothold into that kind of new mode of working, where I was trying to inject more levity, more humor, and also to bring a lot more recognition of a certain kind of banality into the work, I guess, usually for the sake of a cheap joke. But,
I really like how in your statement, so you refer to yourself as a quote navel-gazing self-portrait artist, but
yeah,
then you mentioned there's this sort of quality of like there's a parodic quality, and you're very self-aware and self-critical. But that's an interesting, turn of phrase that you use when framing yourself in your artist statement.
Yeah, I think it's important to point that out. It's hard not to. It's hard to know exactly what to say about it because I'll go off on some tangent. But I think there is this obsession with individuality in the West, and there's all of these attendant like the cult of personality that most artists sort of engage with, and there's all of these other things, and these all come into play, I think, when they did for me anyway, when I went out to make paintings early on. And even now, I mean, I think I'm trying to remain fairly transparent when I produce work now, and I'm not trying to say I figured it out now. Now the work that I'm making is on the level and it's not silly or stupid. I think a lot of my artistic pursuits are still extremely ridden with contradictions and foolishness. And so I think it's important to point out that there's also this obsessive self-reflexivity, and that's where I feel like, I'm trying to call myself out for being a certain kind of fool when I was younger, which is already this kind of introspective, self-reflexive behavior. And then the work that I'm producing to call myself out is like also extremely silly and it's like, recursive in a way, like endlessly just spending all this time getting deeper and deeper inside of like the self, and it's hard not to say it's a little narcissistic or a little navel-gazy to make work like this.
There's this like interesting slippage though between like you and the self-portraiture that's happening in your work, but the way that you're also a stand-in for this kind of art historical tradition of sort of particular kinds of figures standing in environments as per, like a romantic painting or something like that. So it's simultaneously you, but it's also more than you, which is, I think, one of the, great strengths of how you talk about your work, the way that it connects so deeply to art history and so many different movements in art history. And you mentioned that in your statement as well, and sort of list off all these different cultural ideological movements, Classicism, Romanticism, Surrealism, all of those. So that link to art history, I think, is really, it's very, you're walking this fine line between, self-portraiture and sort of inserting yourself into this larger conversation, which is really cool and really successful in all of these pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the slippage is sort of like, before I even knew I was doing it, I think it was already happening, right? So part of what I'm interested in here is this sense that like the things that some 19th century guy was thinking about what art should be, and by extension, what the purpose, let's say the purpose of life should be, if I could be a little bit over the top about this, is like the stuff that was determining how I thought I should be making art as like a 16-year-old or whatever. I mean, it almost entirely defined what I thought was the role of an artist. And so like these things are obviously passed down. I like, you know, it's what Maria would call maybe the, I should note Maria Tomasula, one of our professors would note, she called it like the cultural inheritance, right? It's this like legacy of ideas that we come to perform, I guess you could say. And so in the process of doing this stuff, the work has definitely become about sort of body politics, the way that bodies are inscribed to behave a certain way. And I'm looking at it specifically through the lens of painting, but I think you could do this with really any sort of like cultural performance. You know, there are bound to be slippages because let's say, The Reign of Man is a very Francisco Goya-esque pose, and I think it has that kind of energy to it. But the sort of romantic mode is this like deeply subjective, deeply individualistic, like pathos-ridden form, and it only really exists as this like rejection of the more like reasoned, logistical neoclassicism that preceded it. And then that just existed because of this obsession with what they thought Greece was like. And so I guess what it's come to, where this has all led me, is this obsessive like searching for self just in general. And I think like the impossibility of that. And so you end up just having to focus on like identity formation more than you focus on any sort of like I've long since abandoned any sense that I'm producing works that are authentically me, right? Like it's all a performance. Even as I'm making work about making work as a romantic, I'm making work as a grad student in Indiana who's also subject to a number of very specific kind of cultural expectations. So it's very slippery. I think the self is a very slippery fish. So that's been basically the process. I've definitely moved out of the more the maybe forms of self-portraiture that focus on like verisimilitude or likeness. And I've definitely moved towards these more absurd, nasty, little grotesque creatures and stuff like that. But for the most part, I think the intention has been the same, trying to pinpoint where the different the desires or the now naturalized maybe like, let's say, urges or feelings of, I guess, just kind of feelings of the way that things should be done. I'm just trying to trace those back as far as I can. And the best way for me to do that is to, in some way, incorporate those art historical elements to call them out, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you can just speak a little bit more. We see, as you're going through the slides here, as you mentioned, this move from verisimilitude and sort of recognizable human figures to these grotesque, meaty, very inhuman, creaturely forms in your work. How did that transition happen? Was that something that you were very conscious about, and that was a form you sort of came to in a particular moment, or was it this strange incremental evolution throughout your work? And is that something you've sort of landed on as a recurring element that you want to continue to retain in your paintings?
That's a good question. I think a lot of there's a sort of interest in base materiality that I mentioned earlier, and I think taking the body and making it grotesque was, for me, for the longest time, I mean, since undergrad, a way for me to kind of acknowledge that in some ways. And then I kind of dispelled that specific way of working for a while, but I still did a lot of drawings that were these lumpy, grotesque kind of, I don't know if you could call them bodies, but kind of biomorphic forms. And somewhere along the line, I kind of started to reincorporate them into the stuff that I was making. And I didn't know, it's hard because I think in school, you're kind of expected to know why you're doing something or to maybe anticipate the result that the incorporation of some sort of new form is going to have. And you definitely get better at it. You think a lot more about it, and you kind of learn to anticipate those things. But fundamentally, anytime I've tried something new, like in the program, I have no idea if it's gonna work, or how two different kind of ideas are gonna clash, or if they'll work together or against one another. So I was at the time in the first year basically just emulating the visual languages of Romanticism and Rococo and some of those things. And I wanted, to some degree, I just wanted to see what would happen if I started to integrate more extreme forms of kind of, these lumpy, tumor-ridden looking bodies. And I did have a kind of feeling like addressing that sense of base materiality, the kind of like the meat sack mode. I did have a feeling that that might undermine in some way the vision of like a complete, clean, perfected body. I mean, we talked a lot about, or I think people, you could maybe point to something like neoclassicism and say that there was this idea that real forms are in some way incomplete or imperfect. I think that there's this sort of suggestion that it's the role of the artist to kind of perfect the incomplete forms. And so when I look at something like, a sculpture of David or whatever, like Michelangelo's David, to me it stands as this kind of perfect, clean, autonomous form that stands for really anything that's attendant with the perfect body, which is pretty much, I guess, everything, right? It's the perfect body is like the perfect system of government. It's the perfect reason. It's the perfect everything. So I thought maybe starting to reincorporate these forms would be an interesting way to clash with the art historical reference that I was using. And I think it worked out pretty well, actually. And I've only found in retrospect that there's a lot of writing about doing just that, subjecting the kind of grand idealized forms to these very base forms. I know like Georges Bataille talks about that a lot in his conceptualization of the formless or like abjection. So in retrospect, I think it works for those reasons, but it was kind of just it was more on a lark to begin with when I was producing some of those things, and I had no idea if it would turn out well. But I kind of started to slowly incorporate it. I think like in the Reign of Man, for instance, I've exaggerated the features to such an extent that I find the proportions or the anatomy of this self-portrait to be like really quite disturbing. But certainly it's not to the level of sort of abstraction of something like bubbles on the right there. So,
Yeah, I was.
Sorry, I don't know if that answers your question.
I was going to ask you about that, or that you answered it, but that's how, when I see your work, it kind of, this is the natural kind of evolution I see of it becoming, talking about humanity and like the human and everything involved with it, and how that kind of evolved into the grotesque and how it's kind of morphing and continuing. So it's, to me, it's like a natural progression of how your work is manifesting, like, and continuing to. So I think like the development of those ideas largely, obviously, are informing the work, and it's showing that in the progression of this evolution of like all of these different forms now. Things aren't looking human anymore, or somewhat reminiscent of, but not quite in some instances. Yeah, with some of these new images, and some of this new work that you're making, it's manifesting in its own way and really like getting to the meat of like, I know I had to do that, but the whole meat of this whole like kind of thesis and idea that you're dealing with. So it's interesting that that progression kind of is just happening as you paint these.
Yeah, it's worked out really well in retrospect. I could see it going a number of ways, but I'm glad that it's kind of congealed, sort of come together.
Yeah, and I know that while we're on the topic of sort of like how materiality infuses even just the like subject matter, and you know, how you're thinking about the forms that you're depicting and rendering in 2 dimensions, you've been venturing into some 3D ceramic sculpture, also installation. Can you tell us your interest in that and how you ended up making that sort of move into a 3-dimensional space, or thinking about like possible experiences just beyond the very illusionistic, you know, 2D tradition of painting?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I kind of started to, I have to watch how I say this, but I think I started to think about this weird juxtaposition or this tension between the body as this like, this is the word that I don't want to use, but I'm just going to use it because this isn't reviews or whatever. The real, right? Like there is a body. I have a body. It's now I'm in kind of the zone right now where, because I'm trying to write my thesis, I'm trying to find any sort of ways that the stuff that I'm saying can be flawed. And so for instance, many post-structuralists who are interested in body politics might argue that there is actually no body that exists like pre-cultural inscription, and therefore there can be no real body. So whatever, leaving that aside, I think I got very interested in this idea of like materiality as a kind of a real, like a thing I could hold on to. And in some ways the forms tend to take, you know, I became very formal when I was producing these figures. I make a lot of these kind of surreal drawings where I'm really just shading lumpy forms that I kind of ideate, bad word again, but intuitively, right? Like automatic drawing or whatever. And I just became very interested in the form itself, and then thinking about the way that that comes into this collision point with these ideals that expect certain kinds of performances from these sad little creatures, these sad little bodies, in this case, some sort of self-portraiture. And so because I started to establish that relationship in my head, I started to want to actually see the forms sort of like extruded into 3-dimensional space, to see them in the round. And I had this kind of another angle that I've been taking as I am working, is really trying to think more like viewer centrically, which is something I haven't always done, and wanting to think really seriously about things like scale, which I didn't think much about in the past, and to think about something like a Caravaggio painting where you'd enter into this church and it'd be sort of dimly lit, and the way that it has this chiaroscuro shading and this extreme foreshortening, the way that, and these dark backgrounds, the way that these figures would sort of protrude into your space and feel, you know, give the viewer of that piece like a very different feeling as a result of it. And so one thing I tried to do before I started working in 3 dimensions was just scale up. And I felt that that worked pretty well in the sense of creating a body that felt real and that felt like we were, you know, a viewer might be sharing a space with it. But of course, the extreme of this would be to just to push into, I'm going to skip this for now, to push into like three-dimensionality and to start producing work in the round. This was kind of more, this started as just an experiment. I haven't worked in like coil building or clay for so long. I did a little bit of it in undergrad, but not much past that. And so I wanted to make a work that I felt maintained the forms that I was developing in a more painterly sense, and try to see what effect, once again, kind of an experiment, to see what sort of effect that might have in our space. So this wasn't huge. This piece is maybe, I don't know, a couple feet tall. And I actually ended up producing more work where, I'm gonna skip through these, more work where I was now fusing paintings and sculptures. And so you can see it, like, I think this is a really good example of We Love You, Bubble Boy. It's a really good example of that way that I've been thinking about it, where the body is this real thing that exists in our space, but it has these forms. It is performing in a certain way, in this case, painting. This is another self-portrait, but it also is sort of inscribed. There's this sort of tattoo form, or some people have said that it looks more like a sort of scarification mark of another kind, maybe like a knife cut or something along those lines. And maybe trying, I guess, to me, pushing into three-dimensionality provides me a slightly different, like, language. Maybe language isn't the right word, but a slightly different process to allow for those distinctions to be a little clearer, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much going on in this particular piece. For someone like, for Katie and I, we both have seen your work over the past few years. So this is definitely a big move from working in just paintings to now having this sort of like full installation with so many different layers in both the 2D and the 3D. Again, becoming entangled, or you have a kind of like drawing on a 3D sculpture, then you have an actual painting, but then you have a space that disrupts the illusion of the painting. It's art historical references going on here. There's references to various points and moments in your own body of work that like we can recognize. So this is a really cool piece. Also the documentation, I feel like it's really important to have this sort of like grimy, dim lighting to make, enhance the ambiance or the atmosphere of this installation. So would you mind just talking about this piece in a little bit more depth, and what your thought process was when you were working on this piece, and any like major transitions or discoveries you made when creating We Love You, Bubble Boy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was kind of just a matter of time once I started to think more about like viewer activation, that I was going to end up thinking, at least in some way, about the spectrum between, like, let's say the tableau vivant, or just the tableau on one end, and then maybe like really immersive installation on the other end. Things like, I actually ended up taking took an installation class, before which point I really had very little familiarity with the goals or the functions or the, even the makings of installation, other than whatever I knew from art history classes, which admittedly I've had quite a few at that point, but had never really been that active in either the production or the experience of installations, let's say. So I think once I had made the sculpture, it presented that previous Or Stranger one, that vessel with the flowers. It presented some other issues that had more to do with how I was going to place that within the context of a show of paintings, right? So obviously at the forefront of my mind right now is the thesis show, but looking forward as well, you want to think about the way that the ways that the materiality may or may not sync up or contradict one another. And so in this case, I had a thought that I could use this, like the structures of installation, to have things play their roles in more specific ways, kind of like I was talking about before with the sculptures. And so one thing that I was doing previously was these picture within a picture situations, these mise en abîme. So in this case, like, I had included this Thomas Cole Garden of Eden painting in the backdrop of this After the Pipes of Pan painting, which was already kind of a redigestion of that Picasso piece right here. And you can see sort of in that right sliver of the painting that there is a suggestion that this is not a scenic backdrop, but is just well, I guess in some ways it is a scenic backdrop. It's not real, or it's not actually supposed to be these figures in a Edenic backdrop. So I started to use that language to kind of point to, well, not only to point to my own process of painting, the fact that these are self-portraits and that I paint these things, but also that in some ways these figures are performing in front of these kind of scenes that they're creating for themselves, right? For one reason or the other. And I would argue that those reasons are largely sort of these inherited cultural forms that these dumb creatures might not even really understand why they're doing it. And so pushing into installation allowed me to do exactly that, right? So the paintings here are sort of these windows to a fantastical world, but really they're just paintings in a space. And I can, there's maybe more of a sense of reality there. I'm not depicting paintings within paintings. Now they're just paintings in spaces. And so, I don't know, people might be familiar with the illusion, with the specific illusion here, but it's the backdrop of Caspar David Friedrich's The Wanderer Above the Sea of Mist or Fog, or however that translates out of German. And then the body, so this provided me this other, possibility to have these three-dimensional forms kind of complete the painting, but also disrupt the painting at the same time. So in some ways, in the original painting, there's a big cluster of rocks upon which the wanderer stands. Whereas in this case, the wanderer, sort of stands upon this lumpy plateau, I guess you could call it. He's kind of squared off and bulky. So there's this mass that completes this painting, but simultaneously disrupts it, not only because it's disgusting, the underwear and just the general physicality, the sort of bodily suggestions of that form, but also because it disrupts it in the 2D to 3D situation. And also, if you don't look at it from the sort of prescribed, the single point where I took these photos from, it doesn't exactly, the mise en abîme doesn't occur either, which I thought was sort of interesting. So it's just all coming, it's coming out of that sense of thinking about how viewers are going to be engaged with this. But there is that secondary thing where I haven't been able to fully articulate it yet, but I think kind of by separating the job of each material, I'm able to speak to the histories of those materials, and I'm able to kind of utilize them in clever ways that allow me to do these different visual puns and kind of goof around better. So that's, I guess, what I'd say about that.
Yeah, I think that, this last piece is really coming to fruition with everything that you've been researching, and I really love everything that's going on in it with the motifs, and just everything you're bringing together. It really seems to be culminating, and I'm super excited about what you're coming up with, and it's really interesting. The romantic painting mixed with the grotesque, mixed with the little the historical and art historical references is really, really coming together. And I am super, super excited. We don't want to release too much, obviously, because we're excited to see what comes next with your work. And it seems like it's going to be super exciting. And we're already, we've been going for an hour now, which time flies, right? Because work's been your work's been just it's fascinating to listen to and talk about. You've answered all my questions on with the grotesque. You're delving into all those interesting topics, art history, everything. And it really answers those for me in this last piece. For the ending, just remarks, I think if we sort of, unfortunately, we'll do another installment maybe of of this coming up, if you're down. But do you have anything coming up that that you want people to know about, other than, any shows or any, traveling, anything like that?
In the meantime, not so much. I don't really have that much lined up. I'm kind of I was talking to you guys earlier about this, but I'm sort of taking a little bit of a rest after this last year. It was pretty intense for me, and I'm sure for everybody else. So I didn't really have much set up. I'm going out to California for a while, probably do some landscape paintings. We'll see what I get up to, but no shows. I'll be, obviously next year that'll change. I'll be working towards the thesis show and everything like that.
Yeah, a
But,
well-deserved break, I'm sure. Definitely, with all the hard work that you put in, definitely.
I should ask the same for you two. Having just graduated, but also having been out of it for a year, do you guys have any shows lined up or anything you're up to here on out?
Anna, do you have anything going on?
Just my thesis show just came down, so that was the latest for me. But of course, we'll share if we've got anything coming up. I can't think of anything off the top of my head other than continuing to interview artists like you and share your work as much as possible. Also, we should mention your social media, which I don't want to mispronounce it. So maybe I'll have you pronounce your Instagram handle and any other places you want people to look you up and check out your work.
Sure. Yeah, the Instagram is at James Ostrander, which is obviously just a play on my names. So it's just JamsOrstranger. That's pretty much it. Just the Instagram. I need to remake. I had a website, but I lost the URL. I need to remake a website. So
Awesome.
We'll link that for sure. And if you ever do update your website, we will also add that link.
Great.
Yeah, and people can follow us at the Familiar Realm on Instagram. I'm just been painting too, and there's Earthly Delights is a show that's going to be put on by Anti-Mag, and I'm going to be a part of that. It's a group show, so I'm super excited about that. And Anti-Mag is a collab out of Brooklyn, so I'm super stoked. And they're awesome people, so super excited. So stay tuned to that. But James, we want to thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for tuning into episode 2 of our Familiar Realm with James. And please check out our Instagram at The Familiar Realm and check out James's work at Jams or Stranger on Instagram. Messed up the first time, but I think I got it the second time. And we will be posting some of his work too on our Instagram, so you can feel free to check it out there. We'll link him there and be on our feed and in our stories. And we will see you next time on The Familiar Realm. Thanks again for tuning in.